She showed up at the funeral repast with a casserole dish and a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and the moment Gideon Mercer turned his back, she pulled his grieving 14-year-old son aside and whispered, "Your daddy's gonna sell this ranch whether you like it or not. Start saying your goodbyes." The boy's face went white as chalk. The neighbors standing nearby heard every word. Nobody moved. Nobody said a thing. Because Darlene Pruitt had been saying quiet, poisonous things in this county for 30 years, and everybody was too afraid of her family's money to stop her. If you've ever watched someone try to pick the bones of a grieving family before the widow's even cold in the ground, you need to see what happens next. Subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end, because what Elena Ashcroft does to change the fate of the Mercer Ranch will stay with you. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning Gideon Mercer drove into Dalton Creek to hire a cook, he told himself he wasn't doing it for himself. He was doing it for the harvest crew. 8 men were arriving in 4 days to work the wheat fields, big men with big appetites who needed 3 hot meals a day and coffee strong enough to strip paint. Gideon couldn't cook. He never could. Ruth had handled the kitchen the same way she handled everything in their life together, quietly, completely, and with a kind of effortless grace that made you forget how hard she was actually working. He hadn't understood that until she was gone. 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days. Not that he was counting. He parked the truck outside the feed store, where the notice board was tacked full of handwritten cards. He scanned them without much hope. Most were kids looking for summer work or retired school teachers offering piano lessons. Then one card caught his eye, written in a steady, unfussy hand on plain white paper. Experienced cook available for ranch or harvest work. Can handle large crews. References on request. E. Ashcroft. A phone number. Nothing else. He stood there a moment. Then he took the card down, folded it once, and put it in his shirt pocket. He made the call from the truck, engine running, because some part of him had already decided he'd drive away if it went to voicemail. It didn't. Ashcroft. The voice was a woman's, calm and direct, the way a person sounds when they've learned to speak without wasting words. "This is Gideon Mercer. I've got a wheat ranch outside Blevins, about 20 miles north. I need a cook for harvest season. 8 men, maybe 10 if my neighbor sends extra. Starts Monday." A pause. Not a hesitant pause. More like she was doing the math in her head. "What time does work start?" 4:30. That means breakfast at 4. Yes. You've got a working kitchen, stove, oven, decent refrigeration? It works. All right, Mr. Mercer. I can be there Sunday evening to settle in. $50 a week plus room and board. He didn't negotiate. He didn't know what the going rate was for a harvest cook, and he didn't care enough to find out. "That's fine." "One thing," she said. "I don't do drama. If there's drama on your crew, you handle it. That's not my department." "There won't be," he said, because there never was. The men who came to work the Mercer harvest were serious workers. Roy Delgado, who'd been coming for 6 years, kept the others in line without being asked. "Then I'll see you Sunday, Mr. Mercer." She hung up. He sat there for a moment, hand still on the phone, and realized he hadn't given her directions. He called back. She picked up on the second ring and didn't say a word about it, just took down the directions like he was reading them off a map, asked one clarifying question about the county road number, and said goodbye again. That should have been the end of it. A transaction. Help hired. But all the way home, the sound of her voice sat in the cab of that truck with him, steady and unadorned, and it irritated him in a way he couldn't entirely explain. It had been a long time since a voice affected him at all. Sunday came gray and cool, the way Montana Septembers do when they're reminding you that summer was a gift, not a promise. Gideon spent the morning fixing a loose board on the bunkhouse steps, not because it needed doing today, but because standing still made the quiet too loud. The house was cleaner than usual. He'd told himself that was for the cook's benefit, but he knew it was because he hadn't wanted a stranger to see what the place had become. Ruth's things were still everywhere. A needlework she'd never finished still hung beside the kitchen window. Her gardening boots were still by the back door. He'd moved them once, 3 months after she died, and then put them back the same day because the absence of them was worse than having them there. He was splitting wood when the truck came up the drive. It was an older model, a faded blue Ford that had seen better decades, and it moved slowly up the rutted lane like it was in no hurry and had no intention of apologizing for that. When it stopped near the barn, the driver's door opened and Elena Ashcroft stepped out. She was not what he'd expected. He didn't know what he'd expected exactly, but this woman was somewhere in her late 40s, he guessed, with dark hair shot through with gray pulled back from her face in a practical knot. She was lean in the way that working women are lean, not from vanity, but from labor. And she carried herself with her shoulders level, the way someone does when they've learned not to make themselves small in spaces where they're not entirely welcome. She looked at the house, then at the barn, then at him. One slow survey, taking inventory. "Mr. Mercer," she said. No question in it. She'd already decided he looked like his voice. "Miss Ashcroft." He set the axe against the woodpile and came forward, but didn't extend his hand. She noticed that, he was pretty sure, but she didn't react. "I'll show you the kitchen." "Thank you." He led her in through the back door, and as she stepped across the threshold, she paused for just a second. Long enough for him to know she'd seen Ruth's boots. She didn't say anything about them. She stepped around them carefully and followed him to the kitchen. The kitchen was large for a ranch house. Ruth had wanted it large, had drawn the plans herself when they'd expanded the house 12 years back, because she'd believed the kitchen was where a family actually lived. There was a cast iron range, a propane oven, a long wooden prep table scarred with decades of use, and a row of copper pots hanging from a beam overhead that hadn't been touched in 2 years. Elena walked the perimeter of the kitchen without being invited to. She checked the oven's temperature by turning it on and holding her hand near the door. She tested the burners. She opened the refrigeration unit and looked at what was inside, which wasn't much. "I'll need a supply run tomorrow morning," she said, "before the crew arrives. I can make a list tonight." "I'll drive you." She glanced at him. "I can drive myself if you give me an account at the feed store." "I'll drive you," he said again, not harshly, but with the finality of a man who wasn't used to being redirected on his own property. He half expected her to push back. She didn't. She simply nodded and went back to examining the kitchen. "You know how many men you're expecting?" she asked. "8 for certain. Roy, that's my foreman. He might bring his cousin if the rain holds off in the east fields." "I'll plan for 12, she said. "Better to have extra." She found a notepad on the counter, Ruth's notepad, still with Ruth's handwriting on the first page, a grocery list from 2.5 years ago. And Elena turned to a fresh page without reading what was there. That careful, blind turn of the page. He noticed it. His jaw tightened. "I'll get you set up in the spare room," he said. "Down the hall. It's small." "Small is fine." He showed her the room. It had a single bed, a chest of drawers, a window that faced the north field. No mirror. He'd taken the mirror out months ago and never put it back and had never thought about why until this moment. "If you need another lamp, this is fine," she said. "Thank you." She set her bag on the bed and Gideon stood in the doorway for a moment, feeling the particular awkwardness of a man who doesn't know how to behave as a host because he hasn't been one in years. "Dinner's on your own tonight," he said. "I'll be at the barn." "I'll find something," she said, already unpacking. He left. He went to the barn and did things that didn't need doing, and the kitchen light was on when he came back in after dark. He smelled something. Bread. Fresh bread, the yeast smell of it, warm and completely unmistakable, filling the entire back half of the house in a way that stopped him cold in the mudroom with his boots half off. His chest did something complicated and unasked for. He stood there until it passed. Then he finished taking off his boots and went to his room without going near the kitchen. Tut-tut. Monday arrived with Roy Delgado's truck in the yard before the sun was properly up, followed by 2 more pickups carrying the rest of the crew. 8 men in total, dusty and loud and cheerful in the way that men who do hard physical work together are cheerful. A little rough, a lot honest. Roy was a solid man, 53 years old, with a gray mustache he'd been growing for 30 years, and a handshake that could crack knuckles if he wasn't careful. He'd known Gideon since they were in their 20s, which meant he was one of maybe 3 people on Earth who was allowed to say what he actually thought to Gideon Mercer's face. "You hired a cook," Roy said as they stood in the yard watching the men unload gear. "Needed one," Gideon said. "Woman cook? Is that a problem?" Roy looked at him. No, I'm just noting it. Note it quietly. Roy's mustache moved in what might have been a smile. The boys smell bread all the way from the drive. That's a good sign. It was a good sign. When the crew filed into the kitchen at 4:15 that morning, stomping boots on the mat, tugging off hats out of instinct, not quite sure what they were walking into, Elena was already there. Coffee was made. Eggs were in pans. Bacon was in the oven, not the stovetop, which meant it cooked evenly instead of getting crisp on one side. There was a stack of biscuits on the center of the table that made two of the younger men stop talking mid-sentence. She did not smile at them. She did not fuss over them. She said, "Plates are there, coffee's there, sit down," in the same direct voice she'd used on the phone with Gideon, and the men sat down. Harlan Briggs, who was 22 and from Great Falls, and had never in his life been spoken to that efficiently by anyone, looked at Roy with wide eyes. Roy shook his head slightly. "Don't." Gideon ate at the end of the table, apart from the crew in the way that bosses are apart even when they're in the same room. He drank his coffee and didn't look at Elena. He watched the men eat. He watched them clean their plates. He watched young Harlan reach for a second biscuit and glance up guiltily, the way you do when you're helping yourself to someone else's work, and Elena was already there with the basket, setting it closer to him without a word. Gideon looked down at his coffee. He did not think about Ruth's biscuits. He told himself he did not think about them. He thought about them for a long time. The first real trouble came on Wednesday. It didn't come from the crew. It came from the road, specifically from the long driveway, where a silver car that cost more than Gideon made in a year came rolling up mid-morning while the men were in the east field. Gideon saw it from the fence line and knew before the car even stopped who it belonged to. Darlene Pruitt. There was no mistaking that car in Greer County. He came down from the fence and crossed the yard in time to see Darlene stepping out. 61 years old, silver-haired, dressed in a skirt and blouse that were entirely inappropriate for a ranch visit, which was the point. Darlene dressed to remind you that she was above wherever she was standing. "Gideon," she said with a smile that had been practiced in mirrors. "I was in the area." "You're never in the area, Darlene. It's 20 miles from town." "I wanted to see how harvest was coming." She looked around the yard with the particular interest of someone assessing property, not admiring it. "I heard you hired help. That must be a relief." "It is," he said flatly. "Was there something you needed?" Darlene's eyes moved past him to the kitchen window. Elena was visible through the glass, moving around the prep table. Something shifted in Darlene's expression. Something too quick to catch cleanly, but Gideon caught the edge of it. "A cook," Darlene said. "Interesting." "She's doing the job," Gideon said. "I've got work to get back to." "Of course." Darlene looked at him with that professional sympathy she deployed the way other people used weather as small talk. "You know, I've been meaning to say, if the harvest is harder than you expected, and you find yourself needing to think about the future of the property, I'm not selling. I'm not suggesting, Darlene." His voice didn't rise, but something in it closed like a gate. "I'm not selling this ranch. Not this year. Not the next year. Not because of a hard harvest. I know what you've been telling people in town about how I can't manage this place alone. I know what you said to Caleb at Ruth's repast." That landed. He saw it land, a small stiffening at the corner of her mouth. "Caleb's 14 years old," he said. "Keep his name out of your mouth." Silence. A meadowlark somewhere in the field. The distant sound of the harvesting equipment. "I was trying to be helpful," Darlene said, in a voice that had turned winter cold. "You've never been helpful to me a day in your life," he said. "You've been patient. That's different." He walked back toward the barn. He didn't watch her leave, but he heard the car door and the engine and the crunch of gravel under tires, and he didn't breathe easy until all of it faded down the road. When he turned around, Elena was standing at the back door. She had a dish towel over her shoulder. She looked at him, and then at the road, and then at him again. "She a neighbor?" Elena asked. "Of a kind." "She wanted your land." It wasn't a question. He looked at her. "How'd you know that?" "She had the look," Elena said. "I've seen it before." She turned to go back inside, then paused. "Lunch is at noon. I made extra." "You look like you didn't eat breakfast." He had eaten breakfast. He'd eaten it at the table with the crew, same as every morning. But she was right that he hadn't tasted it, and somehow that bothered him more than the lie would have. That evening, after the crew had eaten supper and gone to the bunkhouse, after the kitchen had been cleaned and the pots put away, Gideon came in to get a glass of water and found Elena sitting at the table. She wasn't doing anything. She wasn't reading. She wasn't writing. She was just sitting with her hands around a cup of tea looking at the window above the sink, and she did not look distressed. She looked like a person who had learned how to be alone with herself in a way that cost nothing. He filled his glass. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a coyote called from somewhere on the north ridge. "There's something you need?" he said, because silence with a stranger in his kitchen was harder to manage than silence alone. "No," she said, just winding down. He should have taken his water and gone to his room. That was the sensible thing. Instead, he stood at the counter, and after a moment he said, "The bread on Sunday night, the house hasn't smelled like that in a while." He didn't know why he said it. He wished immediately that he hadn't. Elena turned the cup slowly in her hands. "Bread's a good thing to have in a house," she said. Just that. No sympathy in it, no pressing, no invitation to explain what he'd almost started to say. He drank his water, set the glass in the sink, said, "Good night," and went to his room and lay on his back in the dark with his forearm over his eyes, listening to the silence where a woman's voice used to be. He didn't sleep for a long time. When he finally did, he didn't dream about Ruth. That, in its own way, was the thing that broke him open a little in the morning. Not the dream, the absence of it. The first gap where grief had always been. He stood in the kitchen doorway at 3:50 in the morning and watched Elena light the kitchen fire. Quick, efficient, no ceremony, and thought, she's going to be a problem. Not because she'd done anything wrong, not because she'd pushed or pried or made herself at home in a way that trespassed. Because she was real. She was present. And for the first time in 2 years, 3 months, and he stopped counting, he was standing in his own kitchen, and the air felt like it had oxygen in it again. And he hadn't asked for that, and he didn't know what to do with it, and he resented it with every tired, hollow bone in his body. She looked up from the fire and saw him standing there, and she said, "Coffee'll be ready in 10 minutes, and turned back to work. He sat down at the table. He didn't go back to his room. He sat there in the near dark while the fire caught and the kitchen warmed and the coffee came up, and he told himself it meant nothing. Outside, the Montana sky was still black and full of stars, and the wheat fields stood waiting in the dark, and the harvest had barely even started yet. The trouble with harvest season was that it didn't leave room for anything except the work. That was the part Gideon had always liked best about it, the way the days collapsed into a single, relentless purpose that left no space in your head for anything else. Up before dark, out in the fields by first light, the machinery loud enough to fill your skull completely, and by the time you came in for the evening, you were too tired to think. Just eat, sleep, and do it again. 2 weeks of that, and the wheat was in, the crew was paid, and the ranch had money to carry it through winter, clean and simple. That was how it was supposed to work. What Gideon hadn't counted on was Elena Ashcroft making it complicated, not on purpose. That was the thing that gnawed at him because he could have dealt with purpose. He knew how to deal with people who were trying to do something, trying to impress him, trying to get on his good side, trying to maneuver. He'd been around enough of those. What he didn't know how to deal with was a woman who simply woke up at 3:45 every morning and made food and did her job as if the atmosphere of the house were entirely beside the point. By the end of the first full week of harvest, 4 things had changed without Gideon authorizing any of them. The kitchen table had moved 6 inches closer to the window, which meant the morning light hit it differently, and the men ate breakfast with actual daylight instead of sitting under the single overhead lamp like they were being interrogated. Gideon noticed this on Tuesday and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. It was a better position for the table. He just hadn't thought to move it in 2 years. The second thing was that Roy Delgado, who had not eaten a full breakfast before 7 in the morning for the entirety of his adult life on the grounds that his stomach needed time to wake up, had begun arriving in the kitchen at 4:15 and eating 2 plates of eggs. Gideon observed this without comment. The third thing was the window box. Ruth had kept herbs in a window box above the kitchen sink, basil, thyme, a stubborn rosemary that refused to die no matter how cold it got. The box had been sitting empty and dry for 2 years. On Wednesday, Gideon came in from the north field at noon, and there were plants in it again. Not the same plants, small starts, rough little things, not pretty, but alive. He stood looking at them for longer than he meant to. Picked them up on the supply run Monday, Elena said from the stove without turning around. The box was still good, seemed a waste. He could have said something about that. He chose not to. The fourth thing was harder to name. It had to do with the sound of the house in the evenings. He'd gotten used to the silence. The particular quality of silence in a house where only one person lived, which is different from ordinary quiet the way an empty theater is different from a full one. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was the absence of life. He'd gotten so used to it that he'd stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing a smell once you've been in a room long enough. He started noticing it again the moment it changed. And it changed because Elena was in the kitchen every evening, not doing anything dramatic, not taking up space in any way he could object to, just there, moving around, setting things to soak overnight, the small sounds of someone who existed. It made the silence before bed worse than it had been before she came, because now there was a before and after to measure it against. He didn't thank her for the herb box. He didn't mention it again, but he stopped going to bed before the kitchen light went out. Roy found him in the equipment shed on Thursday afternoon, adjusting the tension on the header belt, which had been giving inconsistent cuts in the southwest corner of the east field. Roy came in and didn't say anything for a while, which was his way of announcing he intended to say something eventually. Gideon kept working. "Harlan asked me something this morning," Roy said finally. "What?" "He wanted to know if Miss Ashcroft was coming back next year." Roy leaned against the wall, arms folded. "I told him that was above my pay grade." "It is." "He's not wrong to ask. She's good, Gideon. Better than good. Delgado's cousin, Manny, you remember Manny, built like a barn door. That man has not left a crumb on his plate once this week. I have never in my life seen Manny not leave crumbs." "I'm glad she's feeding people well," Gideon said. "That's what she's here for." Roy was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind picked up across the field, a dry, warm push of air that meant the weather was holding for now. "She fixed the back step," Roy said. Gideon stopped turning the wrench. "What?" "The back step. The one that's been loose since spring. I walked past this morning and it's fixed. She must have done it last night because it wasn't fixed yesterday." Gideon set the wrench down. "I was going to fix that." "I know you were. I had it on the list." Roy's mustache moved. "She didn't say anything about it, just fixed it." Gideon picked the wrench back up. "I'll ask her not to take on repair work. That's not what she's here for." "I wouldn't," Roy said. "Roy, I'm just saying, woman fixes a loose step without being asked, without making a point of it, without expecting credit. That's not someone who's overstepping. That's someone who sees what needs doing." He pushed off the wall. "Ruth used to do the same thing. You just never noticed how often." That landed in a way Roy probably knew it would. Gideon didn't answer. Roy left him alone in the equipment shed, and Gideon stood there with the wrench in his hand and the header belt half adjusted and the mention of Ruth's name sitting in the air like weather. He'd noticed. He'd noticed everything Ruth did. That was the lie you told yourself after someone was gone, that you hadn't paid enough attention, that you'd taken it for granted, that you'd failed to see clearly what was right in front of you. He told himself that story for 2 years, and it had kept him in a particular kind of misery that was at least familiar. At least it was his. The truth was more complicated, and he knew it. He'd noticed Ruth. He'd loved her without reservation, and she'd loved him the same way, imperfectly and completely, and she had died anyway, and the noticing hadn't protected either of them from that. He finished adjusting the header belt. He went back to the field. He did not think about Elena Ashcroft or the back step or the herb box. He told himself that for 20 minutes and then stopped pretending. Friday night, Darlene Pruitt came back. This time she didn't drive up the main road. She showed up at 6 in the evening when the crew was still at supper, which meant she timed it deliberately. Gideon heard her car and came to the kitchen doorway, and through the window he could see her on the porch, dressed differently this time, more casual, as if she'd thought about how to approach this and adjusted her strategy. That was Darlene. She had strategies. He went out. "Darlene, I brought a pie." She held it out. An actual pie, in an actual dish wrapped in a cloth. I wanted to apologize for the other day. I pushed. He didn't take the pie immediately. You did. I know. She had a particular expression that she used when she was being humble, which sat on her face the way a costume sits on someone who isn't entirely comfortable in it. Gideon, I've known you since you and Ruth moved out here. 23 years. I don't want to be your enemy. I don't either, he said, and meant it. He took the pie. Thank you. She looked past him into the kitchen, where through the screen door the sounds of supper, forks on plates, men's voices, a low laugh from Roy, were audible. Your crew sounds settled, she said. They are. And the cook's working out? She's doing fine. He kept his voice neutral, the way you do when you know someone's circling something and you're not going to help them get there. Darlene smiled. Good. I only ask because I heard in town, you know how people talk. She paused. Someone said she was from out of state, passing through. She's hired for harvest, he said. What people do after isn't their business or mine. Of course. Darlene looked at him with something that wasn't entirely warmth, but wasn't entirely calculation either. Somewhere in between, which was where Darlene Pruitt usually lived. Just making sure you're not building on a foundation that might walk away. I appreciate the concern, he said, which was his way of ending a conversation. He held the door open long enough that she understood she wasn't being invited in. She left. He stood on the porch with the pie and listened to her car go down the drive. Behind him, the screen door opened and Elena came out with a dish towel, the way she did after supper. She always came out for a few minutes in the evening air before finishing the kitchen. She stood at the other end of the porch and looked at the sky, which was turning colors over the western ridge. She's persistent, Elena said. You heard that? Kitchen's right there. She wasn't apologetic about it. She's got an interest in this property, and she's not sure what I am yet, so I make her nervous. He looked at her. What do you mean? I mean she came out here twice in 1 week, and both times she looked at that kitchen before she looked at you. Elena turned the dish towel in her hands. She's trying to figure out if I'm a complication. Gideon didn't say anything. Am I? Elena asked. It was direct enough that it stopped him flat. He looked at her. Really looked, for probably the first time since she'd arrived. And she looked back without any particular agenda in it, just waiting for an honest answer the way some people do when they're not afraid of what the answer might be. You're the cook, he said. That's what you are. She nodded, once. All right. She went back inside. He stood on the porch with Darlene's pie, and the evening cooling around him, and he felt, not for the first time this week, like a man who had just told a partial truth and was going to be made to reckon with the rest of it later. Saturday brought a problem with Harlan. The boy. Gideon couldn't help thinking of him as a boy, even though 22 wasn't a boy exactly, had been working hard all week, no complaints, good with the machinery. But on Saturday afternoon, in the bunkhouse, he said something to Manny that Manny took exception to, and by the time Roy got there, there were raised voices and a broken bunk board. Gideon dealt with it the way he dealt with everything on the ranch, directly, without dramatics, without taking sides, making clear to both men that the next incident cost them their week's pay and a walk back to town. Harlan turned red and stared at his boots. Manny cracked his knuckles but nodded. Done. Or it should have been done. Harlan came to the kitchen that evening after supper while Elena was alone cleaning up, and Gideon happened to be in the mudroom. He'd come in for his work gloves and stopped when he heard the boy's voice. Miss Ashcroft, I wanted to say, the food this week, ma'am, it's been real good. I'm not usually the kind of person who says that out loud, but he stopped. My mom used to make biscuits like that, the ones this morning. A pause. Pots being stacked. Did she? Elena said, not unkindly, not effusively either, just listening. She died when I was 9, Harlan said. I wasn't trying to, he made a frustrated sound. I just meant they were good biscuits. I know what you meant, Elena said. Sit down for a minute. Gideon heard the scrape of a chair. He should have announced himself. He didn't. You holding up all right? Elena asked. Not about the biscuits now. I'm fine, Harlan said. Then, after a pause, things with Manny were stupid. I said something dumb. What did you say? Another pause. I told him his work was slow, which it isn't. It's not slow. I don't know why I said it. He wasn't slow. Were you trying to start something? No, I just said it, and then there it was. That happens, Elena said. Words get out before you've thought them through. What matters is what you do after. Silence. Something said on the counter. Did you apologize to him? Elena asked. Mr. Mercer made us shake on it. That's not what I asked. The boy was quiet for a moment. No, he said. I didn't actually apologize. Then that's what you do next, she said. Not severe about it, just clear. Manny's a hard worker. You know that. Tell him you know that. Gideon heard the chair scrape again. Yes, ma'am. There's pie on the counter, Elena said. Help yourself. He heard the boy do exactly that. He heard the muffled sounds of someone eating standing up quickly, the way young men eat when they're embarrassed and grateful at the same time. Gideon put his work gloves on slowly and went back out to the barn without making a sound. He didn't sleep well that night. He lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about the way she'd handled Harlan. Not lecturing, not parenting, not making a performance of kindness. Just straightforward. This is the problem. Here's the solution. Move forward. The efficiency of it was almost like watching a skilled hand do something that looks simple until you try it yourself. Ruth had been like that. Not in the same way because no two people were the same, but with that same quality of cutting to what mattered without cruelty, without theater. It was a rare thing. He closed his eyes. He made himself think about the Eastfield instead, about the South Header section that still needed attention, about the weather coming in next week, which the radio had been vague about in the way that meant it was going to be worse than they were admitting. He was mostly successful. Around midnight, he slept. Sunday was supposed to be a lighter day. Maintenance work, machinery checks, a half day for the crew. Gideon was replacing a belt on the combine when he heard voices at the house and came around to find a woman he didn't recognize standing on the front porch talking to Elena. She was older, 60s maybe, heavyset, wearing a church dress and carrying a covered dish. Gideon came across the yard and the woman looked up. You must be Mr. Mercer, she said. I'm Vera Caulfield. I live down the road, the White House with the 2 maples. I used to bring Ruth a jar of honey every September and She stopped, swallowed. I realized I hadn't been by since she passed, and I felt terrible about that, so I brought a casserole. He stood there. Thank you, Mrs. Caulfield. The woman's eyes moved briefly to Elena, then back to him, with the particular careful neutrality of someone who had clocked the situation and decided it was none of her business. I won't keep you. I just didn't want another year to go by. That means something, Gideon said, and he meant it. Stay for coffee if you'd like. She seemed surprised by the invitation. She looked at Elena, who said, It's fresh, and stepped back to let her in. Mrs. Caulfield stayed 40 minutes. She talked about Ruth, which was something most people in his life had stopped doing. Stopped, he suspected, because they were afraid of upsetting him, when actually the silence around Ruth's name was worse than anything anyone could say. This woman talked about her as a person, about how Ruth had once arrived at her door in the middle of a snowstorm to help deliver a difficult calf that wasn't even Caulfield livestock, about how she'd had a laugh that carried across fields, about how she'd argued with the county planning board for 6 months over a road access issue and won. Gideon listened. He didn't say much, but he listened. Elena sat at the far end of the table with her coffee and didn't try to participate in the conversation, but she refilled cups without being asked. And when Mrs. Caulfield's eyes got wet at one point talking about Ruth's garden, Elena put a hand on her forearm for just a second and then took it away. After Mrs. Caulfield left, the kitchen was quiet. You didn't have to sit with her, Gideon said. I didn't mind, Elena said. She talked a long time. She needed to. Elena started washing the cups. People need to say the names of who they've lost. It's not sad, exactly. It's more like keeping someone from disappearing. He was quiet. The water ran. Ruth, he said. It came out of him like something he hadn't planned to release. Her name was Ruth. Elena turned off the water. She turned around and looked at him. She sounds like she was something, Elena said. She was, he said. And then, because he'd started and stopping felt worse. She was funny. People don't always think of her as funny because she was so capable, so people saw the capable part first. But she was genuinely funny, dry. She'd say one thing and you'd laugh 30 seconds later when it hit you. Elena was leaning back against the sink, arms loose at her sides, not rushing him or shaping the conversation, just there. She hated the cold, he said, which was a problem living in Montana. Every single November she'd say, "Why didn't we move south when we had the chance?" And I'd say, "You've said that every November for 15 years. And she'd say, "And I've been right every year." He stopped. Something moved through his face that he couldn't entirely contain. She said it the November before she got sick. I remember thinking, next November I'm going to say it first just to see what she does. He didn't finish that thought. He didn't need to. Elena didn't say she was sorry. She didn't say Ruth was in a better place. She didn't say anything, actually, for a long moment. Then she said, "What did she do in the spring when the cold broke?" He looked up. "Did she have a thing she did?" Elena said. "When the weather turned?" He thought about it. She planted things. Even if there was still frost at night, the second she saw consistent sun, she was out there with seeds. Drove me crazy. Half of them would die in a late frost, and she knew it, but she'd say, "They need a chance." He looked at the window box. At the rough little herb starts Elena had put there. He didn't say anything about that connection. He didn't need to. Elena didn't acknowledge it either. She just turned back to the sink and finished washing the cups, and Gideon sat at the kitchen table for a few minutes without feeling the need to be anywhere else. That was new. That was something he hadn't felt in his own kitchen in a very long time. Monday was when Darlene made her real move. Not at the ranch this time, at the feed store in town where Roy had gone for a spool of wire and instead found himself in the middle of a conversation he reported back to Gideon with the particular careful expression of a man who knows the information is going to sit badly. "She's been talking," Roy said. They were at the equipment shed, afternoon, telling people you're losing the plot, that the ranch is behind on maintenance, which some of it is, but she's making it sound worse, saying the Mercer place will be on the market before spring. Gideon's jaw tightened. That's a lie. I know it is, but she's saying it at the feed store and the diner and anywhere else people talk. Roy looked at him. She's trying to lower your standing before she makes an offer. Make it look like selling's not a choice you make, it's a conclusion you arrive at. Who's listening? Some. Tom Birch at the bank listened, which concerns me. Gideon stood still. Tom Birch was the loan officer who held the note on the equipment lease. Nothing dramatic, nothing near defaulted, just a routine arrangement. But Darlene having Tom Birch's ear was not a comfortable thing. "I'll go see Tom this week," Gideon said. "That'd be smart." Roy hesitated. "There's something else." She was asking about Elena, who she is, where she's from, making a point of saying she seems like a transient type, someone who moves on. What does Elena have to do with anything? Roy looked at him the way a man looks at a friend who's asking a question he already knows the answer to. "Darlene's smart, Gideon. She can see the ranch is running well this week. She can see the men are steady. If she's trying to build a picture of this place falling apart, the thing that doesn't fit that picture is a well-run kitchen and a stable crew. She wants Elena to be a problem." "Elena's not a problem." "No," Roy said, "but Darlene's going to try to make her one." Gideon went back to the house that evening, and for the first time in a week, he felt the old familiar weight, the gray, exhausted sense of being surrounded by forces that didn't care what he wanted. He sat on the porch after supper, elbows on his knees, and stared at the dark shapes of the fields. He heard the back door, and then footsteps, and then Elena came around the side of the house and sat down on the porch step without asking. Not beside him exactly, a few feet away, her back against the post. "You look like a man who's been thinking too hard," she said. "Probably," he said. "Darlene moving on you?" He looked at her. "Roy told you?" "Nobody told me anything, but you've had that look since you came in from town." She looked out at the dark field. "What's her angle?" He told her. He wasn't sure why he told her. It wasn't her fight, it wasn't her ranch, she was here for harvest season and nothing beyond that. But he told her. The bank, Tom Birch, the rumor campaign, the slow-building pressure that Darlene had been patient about for 2 years, waiting for him to get tired. Elena listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She waited until you were at your lowest." "Yes." "And now she thinks the lowest point stretched long enough that it's become permanent." Elena picked a splinter off the porch post, examined it, dropped it. "People who work like that, they're not counting on you getting up. The whole plan falls apart if you do." He looked at her. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying the best answer to Darlene Pruitt isn't a lawyer or a bank meeting, though you should do both those things." She met his eyes. "It's a good harvest. A finished harvest, on time, on budget, with a crew that came back healthy and a ranch that's standing the same as it was. That's what she doesn't want people to see." He sat with that. "You're talking about it like you have a stake in it." She held his gaze for a moment. "I cook 3 meals a day for 8 men in your kitchen," she said. "That means I've got a stake in it for the next 10 days at least." She stood up, brushing off her skirt. "Finish your coffee and get some sleep. 4 o'clock comes fast." She went back inside. He sat there a while longer. The fields were dark and still. The stars were enormous overhead, the way they are in Montana when the weather's clear, like someone poured salt across a black floor. He thought about what she'd said. The whole plan falls apart if you get up. He hadn't been planning on getting up. He'd been planning on enduring. Those were 2 different things, and somewhere in the last week, in this kitchen that smelled like bread again, and had herb starts in the window box and sounds of life in it after dark, the line between the two had started to blur in a way he couldn't fully account for. He went inside. He went to bed. He lay in the dark and thought about 10 days. The end of harvest season, the crew going home, the equipment put away, the house going quiet again. Elena Ashcroft packing her things into the old blue Ford and heading back to wherever she'd come from. 10 days. It was what she'd been hired for. He told himself that was fine. He told himself that from the beginning he'd known exactly what this was. He almost believed it. Outside, the wind picked up across the north field. A new wind, edged with something colder than last week's air, carrying in its back the early warning smell of a Montana storm building somewhere far to the west, patient and indifferent, already deciding what it was going to do. The storm the radio had been vague about arrived on Tuesday. It didn't arrive the way Montana storms usually did, with a day of warning clouds and a dropping barometer that gave you time to get equipment under cover and battened down. This one came fast, the way the worst ones do, dropping out of the northwest in the space of 3 hours like something that had been holding its breath and finally let go. By 10 in the morning, the sky had turned the color of a bruise. By noon, the wind was knocking loose boards off the equipment shed, and the temperature had fallen 22 degrees from the morning reading. Gideon got the crew in from the east field at 11:30, which was later than he should have, because he'd spent 40 minutes convincing himself the system would slide north like the last 3 had. It didn't slide north. Roy found him at the combine and said, with the economy of a man who was trying not to say, "I told you so," "We need to be inside, boss." They made it. Barely. By 1 in the afternoon, the rain was horizontal, the kind that stings exposed skin and turns the yard into something that swallowed boots. The crew piled into the house. Not the bunkhouse, because the bunkhouse roof had a section Gideon had been meaning to repair since August, and he didn't trust it under this kind of load. 8 men in the main house, plus Roy, plus Elena, who had spent the morning reading the sky through the kitchen window and had already put 2 extra pots of coffee on and pulled everything perishable from the cold storage in case the power went. The power went at 1:15. Elena lit the oil lamps without commentary, the way someone does when they've dealt with this before, and the kitchen went amber warm in a way that, under other circumstances, might have been pleasant. Gideon stood at the window and watched water sheet across the yard and thought about the north field, the equipment he'd gotten under cover, and the equipment he hadn't, the section of fence along the west pasture that was already marginal. "Fence is gone," Roy said, appearing at his elbow. "I know. West pasture cattle are going to be in the grain field by morning. I know. Nothing we can do about it tonight." "I know," Gideon said, and Roy understood that to mean the conversation was finished and moved away. The crew settled into the front room and the mud room and wherever they could find space. Some played cards. Manny slept sitting up against the wall, which was apparently a skill he'd developed over years of harvest seasons. Harlan had found Ruth's old checkerboard in the hall closet and was teaching a kid named Dell something close to the rules. Gideon moved between the window and the kitchen, not sitting, not settling. The house was full of people, and he felt crowded by it in a way that had nothing to do with space. He hadn't had 8 people in this house since Ruth's memorial service. Elena was at the stove, keeping the heat up in the kitchen since the furnace was gas-ignited, but the igniter was electric, and the backup lighter wasn't where it was supposed to be. She was making soup, not from a recipe as far as Gideon could tell. She was working from whatever was in the pantry, which was the kind of cooking you either knew how to do or you didn't. "You don't have to feed them lunch," he said. "They're not working." "They're here," she said. "That's enough of a reason." He stood at the kitchen doorway and watched her for a moment. "You've been through storms before." "Several." She didn't stop moving. "Wyoming, mostly. One bad one in Nebraska that lasted 4 days." 4 days? She was chopping onions with the economical speed of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. By day 2, you run out of things to talk about and start talking about things you usually don't. He didn't respond to that. He went back to the window. The storm didn't let up through the afternoon. By 3 o'clock, the wind had found every loose thing on the property and was demonstrating its findings loudly. A shutter on the east side of the house banged rhythmically until Roy got a piece of wire around it. The barn cats, all 3 of them, somehow made it into the mudroom and were tolerated because nobody had the energy to remove them. At 4 o'clock, Gideon's son Caleb called from his grandmother's house in Billings, where he'd been spending the last 2 weeks of summers before school started. Gideon took the call in the hallway, away from the noise of the front room. "Dad, I saw on the news there's a bad storm up there," Caleb said. He was 14 and tried to sound casual about things that worried him, which meant he sounded overly casual, which was its own kind of tell. "It's a good one," Gideon said. "We're all inside. Equipment's mostly undercover." "Mostly?" "Some of it. Are you okay?" The question stopped him for a second. Caleb had started asking that question about 8 months after Ruth died, in a careful, too-adult way, and Gideon had never entirely worked out whether the boy was checking on him or checking on the ranch or both, because with Caleb, those things were sometimes wound together in ways that were hard to separate. "I'm fine," Gideon said. "Storm will pass tonight or tomorrow morning. Don't worry." "I'm not worried," Caleb said, which meant he was. "How's your grandmother?" "She made me reorganize her tool shed." "Sounds right." A pause. "Dad, is the cook still there? The one you hired?" Gideon leaned against the hallway wall. "Yes. Why?" "Roy texted me, said she was good." Roy texted his 14-year-old son about the harvest cook. He filed that away. "She is good. The crew's eating well. Roy said she fixed the back step. Roy texts you a lot. He sent like 3 messages total." A pause that had something in it Gideon couldn't quite read through the phone. I haven't been home in 2 weeks. I wanted to know how things were." "Things are fine, Caleb." "Yeah." Another pause. "Okay. Call me when the storm's over." "I will." He hung up and stood in the hallway for a moment, holding the phone. Roy texted his son about Elena fixing the back step. He wasn't sure whether to be irritated about that or not. He decided not. Roy had known Caleb since the boy could walk, and the back step had been broken since spring. And maybe it mattered more to other people that it was fixed than it mattered to him. Maybe he'd stopped noticing the things that needed fixing so long ago that he'd stopped knowing they were broken. That thought stayed with him. Supper that evening was crowded and loud and warmer than anything the Mercer house had seen in years, even with no electricity. Elena had made 2 pots of soup, bean and ham, dense enough to be a meal on its own, and there was cornbread that she'd baked in the cast-iron skillet on the stovetop because the oven needed the igniter. It was not the prettiest cornbread. It was slightly uneven and brown on the bottom from the direct heat. Nobody cared. Gideon sat at his end of the table and ate and watched his crew eat, and thought about the last time this kitchen had been full of people who were comfortable. The memory surfaced before he could stop it. A Sunday in October 4 years ago, Ruth's birthday, Caleb, 8 years old, and insisting he was old enough to help make the cake, which had resulted in a cake that leaned noticeably to the left and tasted better than any straight cake had a right to. Ruth's laugh at the table. Caleb's proud, anxious face. He put his spoon down. He looked at the soup. Across the table, Harlan was telling a story about a harvest season in North Dakota that involved a mechanical bull and a county fair, and getting very detailed about neither, in the way of stories that are funny in the telling and probably weren't funny at the time. Dell was laughing. Even Manny had one corner of his mouth up. Roy was watching Gideon. Roy was always watching, which was both his greatest quality as a foreman and the thing Gideon found most wearing about him. Elena was at the stove, ladling second servings, and didn't seem to be listening to Harlan's story, but Gideon noticed she was smiling at the stovetop in a way that meant she was. He made himself pick up the spoon and finish his soup. After supper, the crew drifted back to the front room and the card game and the general low noise of men who've done a hard week and have nowhere to go. The wind outside had not let up. If anything, it was louder, finding new angles and new things to argue with. Elena cleaned up with help from Dell, who had volunteered without being asked, and was doing a creditable job with the pots. Gideon stood at the kitchen window with coffee that had been reheated twice and watched the rain make rivers in the yard. When Dell finished and went back to the front room, the kitchen was quiet except for the storm. "You've been somewhere else all day," Elena said. He didn't pretend not to know what she meant. "I keep thinking about the fence, the cattle. That's not what I'm talking about." He was quiet. "You can say it's none of my business," she said. She was wiping down the prep table, not looking at him. "That's fine." "It's my son," he said. "He called this afternoon." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "He's been gone 2 weeks, and he called to ask how things were, and what he actually meant was he wanted to know if I was still—" He stopped. "He's 14, and he checks on me. That shouldn't be the arrangement." Elena set down the cloth. She turned around and leaned against the table. "When did it start?" "Him checking on you." "About 8 months after Ruth died." He said her name easier than he used to, he noticed. "He was 12. He'd come in the evenings and find things to do in the kitchen while I was in the other room. Just be nearby. I didn't understand what he was doing at first." He paused. "He was making sure I was still there." Elena didn't fill the silence. Outside, the storm hit the house with a gust that rattled every window. "He's a good kid," Gideon said. "Sounds like it," Elena said. "He shouldn't have to be that good." His voice came out rougher than he intended. "He lost his mother, and then he spent the next year making sure he didn't lose his father to grief. And I let him. I let a 12-year-old carry that." He set the coffee cup down, hard enough that it rang on the counter. "I was so deep in it I didn't even see what he was doing until months later, and by then it was just the pattern. Him watching me pretending not to notice." "You noticed," Elena said. "Not soon enough." "Maybe not, but you noticed." She was looking at him straight on, not with pity, not with the careful softness people used when they were trying to avoid upsetting you, just clear. "What did you do when you realized?" He was quiet for a moment. "I told him he didn't have to do that I was all right." "Were you?" "No." "Did he believe you?" "No." He almost laughed, a short, dry sound. "He's too smart for it. He's always been too smart for my particular brand of bullheadedness." Elena looked down for a moment. Then she said, "How long has it been since you told him the truth, that you're not all right?" The question landed in the way that simple, precise questions land when they found the exact thing you've been avoiding. Gideon didn't answer right away. He stood in the lamplight in the kitchen that smelled like soup and rain and coffee, and he thought about Caleb's voice on the phone 3 hours ago. "Are you okay, Dad?" with that too careful, too adult calm. And he thought about the last 2 years, 3 months, and he'd stopped counting, but the count was still in him somewhere. "I don't tell him things like that," he said. "Why not?" "Because he's 14. He's been your partner in this house whether you asked him to be or not," she said. Not an accusation, just true. Keeping things from him to protect him might just be keeping him at a distance. Gideon looked at her. He thought about saying that it was more complicated than that, which was true. He thought about saying that she didn't know Caleb, which was also true. He thought about pushing back on the whole thing, because pushback was his default setting when someone got close to something he'd walled off. He didn't do any of that. He said, "I know." Just that. 2 words, and they cost him something. Elena nodded. "He's going to be home when harvest ends." "Week and a half," Gideon said. "Good," she said. "Tell him then." She picked up the dish towel. She was done with it. Done in the way Elena was done with things, cleanly and without making a moment out of the ending. She moved to hang the towel on its hook, and something caught, her foot on an uneven floorboard, a misstep, the kind of ordinary thing that happens in kitchens. And she grabbed the counter's edge to catch herself and winced. "You all right?" Gideon said. "Fine." She straightened, but her face had changed slightly, a tightening around the eyes. "Your ankle?" "Old injury." "It catches sometimes." She said it the way people say things they've said many times before, the short version of a longer story. He hesitated. "Old injury from what?" She was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hand still on the counter's edge, and then she looked at the window at the rain, and he thought she was going to redirect the conversation the way she usually did when something got close to her own history, efficiently, without making a show of it. Instead, she said, "I had a daughter. Her name was Iris." He was very still. "We were crossing into Wyoming from the east," Elena said. Her voice had changed, flatter, more careful, the way voices go when they're reciting something they've rehearsed into a kind of numbness. "Wagon road. It was spring, and the melt had made the crossing unpredictable. I didn't read it right." She stopped. "She was 4 years old. The water took her before I could—" She stopped again. Gideon did not say he was sorry. He did not say anything because he knew from the inside of grief that the words people reached for in moments like this were not wrong exactly, but they slid off the surface of the thing instead of meeting it. "The ankle," Elena said more quietly, "was from going in after her." She said it like a fact, just information. But her hand on the counter's edge was white at the knuckles. "How long ago?" he said. 7 years. She breathed once, slow. She would have been 11 this year. He stood there and let that land. Let it be what it was, without trying to manage it, or soften it, or fill it with something easier. "I carry it the same way you carry Ruth," she said. "Not better, not smarter. I just got further from the beginning of it." She finally let go of the counter's edge. Her hand was still. That's all surviving is most of the time. Just getting further from the beginning. The storm hit the house again. A door somewhere banged. In the front room, someone laughed at something from the card game. "Iris," Gideon said. Elena looked at him. "It's a good name," he said. Something moved across her face that she didn't try to stop. It wasn't quite crying. It was the thing that's adjacent to crying, the thing that happens when someone says the name of who you lost. In the same way Mrs. Caulfield saying Ruth's name had done something in him a week ago. Just the acknowledgement, just, she was real, and I know her name. "Thank you," Elena said, very quiet. They stood in the kitchen while the storm did what storms do, and neither of them said anything else for a while. And it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was something else. 2 people who had been alone in their grief for a long time, sitting with the strange, unfamiliar weight of not being alone in it, even briefly. The night got worse before it got better. At 9 o'clock, Roy came to the kitchen door looking like a man who had been elected to say something nobody wanted to say. "The bunkhouse roof section came down," he said. "East corner. Nobody in there, so that's fine. But we're going to be tight." "Front room," Gideon said. "Move the furniture." "Already started." Roy hesitated. "Gideon, that's going to be a repair." "I know." "Before the freeze." "Roy, I know." Roy nodded and went back. Gideon stood in the kitchen for a moment, doing the arithmetic he'd been avoiding. The repair, the fence, the cattle in the grain field, the equipment that hadn't made it undercover, the storm's bill, coming in column by column. Elena, reading his face. Serious? Add it to the list, he said. Is the list long? He looked at her. Getting there. She thought for a moment. The crew's inside and fed, and it's not your fault the roof was already marginal. She said it practically, not to comfort him, but because it was accurate. Everything else is weather. Weather happens. You sound like someone who's rebuilt from worse. I have, she said simply. You do it in order. You start with what's broken and work forward. You don't look at the whole list all at once. He looked at the list all at once, every time. Had done it for 2 years, standing in the dark doing arithmetic on everything he'd let fall behind, everything that was failing, every measure by which the ranch was less than it had been when Ruth was alive. That was how he'd been managing it, by accounting for every deficit in detail, as a kind of penance. You do it in order, he repeated. One thing at a time, she said. First the fence, then the roof section, then whatever comes after that. And if there isn't enough money for all of it, then you find out which one matters most. She met his eyes. But you don't let Darlene Pruitt decide that for you. He'd almost forgotten about Darlene in the last 6 hours. The storm had a way of reducing everything to the immediate. But she was right. Darlene's entire plan depended on him looking at the list all at once and feeling it was insurmountable. That had been her strategy from the start. She hadn't created the problems on the Mercer Ranch. She'd just been patient, waiting for them to accumulate past the point where he could see the way out. I need to go to the bank this week, he said, not because I'm in trouble, because Tom Birch needs to see me walk in the door steady. Yes, Elena said, and I need to get Mrs. Caulfield's boy, he does masonry and framing, out here for the bunkhouse roof before the freeze. Yes. And I need to call Caleb and tell him we had a rough night, but it's handled. Elena nodded. He looked at her. You're good at this. At what? At making things seem possible when they looked like they weren't. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I'm good at starting over. I've done it enough times that I'm not scared of it anymore. She picked up the dish towel she'd set down earlier, then seemed to decide she didn't need it and set it back down. What you're doing isn't starting over. You've got a foundation. You've got land, equipment, a good crew, a son who loves you enough to worry about you from 200 miles away. That's not starting over. That's... She paused, looking for the word. That's restarting. It's easier. It doesn't feel easier. I know. Grief makes everything feel like it's from scratch. She looked at him. But it's not. You built something here. You just have to decide to keep building. That was the longest thing she'd said to him about anything personal. Not about his situation, but about herself inside it. She who had built from absolute scratch, who had lost the kind of thing you don't replace, who had gotten further from the beginning by force of will and nothing else. And she was standing in his kitchen telling him his situation was the easier one. He didn't know whether that was comforting or shaming and suspected it was both. Go get some sleep, he said. I'll sit up a while. I'll sit up too, she said. Kitchen's warmer. He didn't argue. He pulled a chair to the window where he could see the yard, and she sat at the table with her tea, and the storm went on outside and the lamp burned between them, and nobody said anything for a long time. Around midnight, the wind began to ease. Not much and not all at once, but you could hear the difference, a slight pulling back like someone drawing a breath. The rain was still heavy, but it had lost its horizontal character. Gideon watched the yard and thought about fences and roofs and bank appointments and a 14-year-old boy checking his phone for news from home. He thought about Iris, 4 years old, an 11-year-old who would never be 11, and the woman who had carried that for 7 years alone on working ranches from Wyoming to Nebraska to here, getting up at 3:45 every morning and lighting kitchen fires because that was the work, and the work was what she had. Elena, he said. She looked up. When harvest is done, he stopped, started again. There's always winter work here, more than I can handle alone. I wasn't going to mention it because it's not what you were hired for, and I don't... He was making a mess of this, which was unlike him, and she was watching him with that steady attention she gave everything, and it made the mess worse. If you were looking for a reason to stay in the area, I'm not saying you are. I don't know your plans. I don't have plans, she said. That's generally how I've operated. Then I'm saying I could use the help. Into winter. Pays the same. You'd have the same room. She held her teacup in both hands and looked at him for a moment. Something moved in her expression, something considered and private, like a decision being examined from all angles before it was made. One thing at a time, she said. He waited. Let's finish the harvest, she said. Then we'll see. It wasn't a yes. He told himself he wasn't hoping for a yes, that it was a practical matter, that the ranch needed a good cook through the winter, and she was a good cook, and that was the beginning and end of it. He almost convinced himself. Outside, the rain went on, softer now, the storm losing its conviction. In the front room, someone had stopped playing cards, and the house was settling into the particular quiet of people sleeping in a full house, different from the silence of an empty one. The lamp between them burned low. Neither of them moved to go to bed for a long time. By 2 a.m, the rain was barely there, and the stars were beginning to show at the western edge of the sky. Not many, just a few, but enough to mean it was ending. Gideon watched them come out, one at a time, and thought about Caleb coming home, about the fence, about the roof, about doing it in order, about restarting instead of starting over. He turned from the window and Elena was asleep in her chair, her tea gone cold, her head tilted slightly against the wall. She looked, in that unguarded moment, like someone who had finally put down something heavy. Not at peace exactly. He didn't think she'd reached peace, and suspected she knew better than to aim for it. Just resting, just getting further from the beginning. He got the blanket from the hall closet, Ruth's blanket, the heavy wool one she'd kept for cold nights, and set it over Elena's shoulders without waking her. He went to his chair by the window. He sat there as the rain stopped entirely and the stars came out in earnest, spilling across the Montana sky in the reckless abundance they always had after a storm, as if they'd been waiting. He didn't sleep. He sat and thought about the ranch, about what needed doing and in what order, about a son who checked on him from 200 miles away, about a woman who'd put herb starts in an empty window box because they needed a chance. He didn't notice when he started thinking about the future instead of the past. He just noticed, at some point before first light, that that was what he was doing. The morning after the storm, Gideon was up before first light. Not because Elena had the kitchen fire going. She was still in her chair when he'd last checked at 4, the wool blanket where he'd left it across her shoulders, but because he'd made a decision somewhere in the hours between the rain stopping and the stars coming out, and decisions had always worked on him the way coffee did on other people. Once it was in him, sleep was done. He pulled on his boots in the mudroom and went out to see what the storm had left behind. It was worse than he had hoped and better than he'd feared, which was more or less the range of outcomes available to a Montana rancher after a September storm. The west fence was down in 2 sections, which he'd expected. 3 equipment pieces that hadn't made it under cover had taken water damage he'd need to assess in daylight. The yard was a mess of branches and standing water, and 1 feed bucket that had traveled from the north side of the barn to somewhere near the garden, which was a good 40 yards of travel. The bunkhouse east corner was bad. He stood and looked at it in the gray pre-dawn and did what Elena had told him to do. He started with what was broken and worked forward, and he did not look at the whole list at once. The corner was maybe 12 feet of roofline. That was a job for 1 good framing carpenter and 2 days of weather. Not a catastrophe. He pulled out his notebook and wrote down the name of Mrs. Caulfield's boy, Tommy Caulfield, who did solid framing work, and put a circle around it. Then he walked the fence line with a flashlight and marked the 2 down sections with orange flagging tape, because the cattle had in fact gotten into the south grain field overnight, and the first order of business after breakfast was getting them back. By the time he came back to the kitchen, Elena was up. She'd folded the blanket and set it on the counter and was at the stove with the fire going, coffee already on, her hair still in the sleep-loosened knot she'd had all night. She looked like someone who had slept in a chair for 4 hours, which she had, and was declining to make an issue of it. "Cattle in the south field," Gideon said. "I figured." She handed him a cup. 2 fence sections down, bunkhouse corners manageable. "Good." He drank the coffee standing up. "How's your ankle?" "Fine." She turned back to the stove. Better when I move around on it. He watched her for a moment. She was moving carefully, not limping, but not quite even either, the old injury making itself known the way old injuries do after a body's been still for hours in a cold kitchen. He thought about Iris and the spring crossing, and 7 years of carrying that alone across working ranches in 3 states, and he looked at his coffee and said nothing about any of it. What he said was, "I'm going to ask you something. All right? And I want you to think about it before you answer. Not right now, not this morning, but before harvest is over." She turned around and looked at him. "I want you to stay on," he said. "Not as a favor, and not because I can't find someone else. Because you're the right person for what this ranch needs, and I know it, and I think you know it, and I'm tired of talking around things." He held her gaze. "Partner wage. Real wage, not cook's pay. You'd have standing to manage the house and the hands the way you think is right. Your room's yours as long as you want it." Elena was quiet for a moment. Not uncertain. She didn't look uncertain. She looked like someone who was being asked something serious and was treating it as such. "You're not asking me to stay as a cook," she said. "No." "Then what are you asking me to stay as?" He thought about how to answer that. He thought about the 17 different ways it could be misread or reduced to something smaller than what he meant. Then he said, "Someone who has a stake in this place. Someone who helps me figure out what it's supposed to be going forward." She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across her face that he couldn't read entirely, and he wasn't sure he was supposed to. "I told you," she said finally, "let's finish the harvest. Then we'll see." "That's what you said last night. It's still true this morning." She turned back to the stove. "Go get your cattle out of the grain field." He went. Roy had the crew up and working within an hour of breakfast. Storm damage or no storm damage. That was what Gideon paid him for, and Roy never let him down on it. The men moved the cattle back through the downed fence sections. Manny and Dell held temporary wire, while Roy reset the posts on the worst section, and Harlan drove the equipment pieces to the shed for assessment with a cheerfulness that suggested last night's enforced proximity, bad weather, and card games and cornbread by lamplight had done something to the younger crew members that Gideon hadn't entirely expected. They were easier with each other. The friction that had existed the previous week, Harlan's needling of Manny, the edge between Dell and one of the older hands named Pete, had been worn down overnight by shared inconvenience, the way rough surfaces smooth against each other under enough pressure. Gideon noticed it and kept it to himself, but Roy caught his eye across the fence line mid-morning and gave a small nod that meant he'd noticed too. By noon, the Southfield fence was back up, rough but functional. The cattle were where they belonged. Gideon had called Tommy Caulfield about the bunkhouse roof and gotten a yes for Thursday, which was as fast as could be hoped for. He'd left a message at the bank asking for a meeting with Tom Birch at the end of the week. One thing at a time. He drove into Dalton Creek on Wednesday, which was not his usual day for town, because he had made up his mind that Tom Birch was not going to hear Darlene Pruitt's account of the Mercer Ranch's condition without hearing the opposite from the source. He went to the bank in his good shirt, not his best, which would have been trying too hard, but the clean flannel with the collar, and he asked the teller for Tom Birch without an appointment and stood in the lobby until Tom came out. Tom was a man in his late 50s, balding, with the kind of careful neutrality that bank officers developed over careers of being trusted by people with opposite interests. He shook Gideon's hand and didn't look uncomfortable, which could have meant anything. "Gideon, I was going to call you this week." "I saved you the trouble," Gideon said. "Can we talk in your office?" They sat across a desk and Gideon put his elbows on his knees and said directly, "I've heard Darlene Pruitt's been in to see you." Tom's expression was exactly as neutral as it had been in the lobby. "I can't discuss—" "I'm not asking what she said," Gideon said. "I'm telling you what the ranch looks like from the inside. Harvest is running 6 days ahead of last year's schedule. Crew of 8, operating clean, no incidents. I had storm damage Tuesday night, fence and a bunkhouse corner, and both will be repaired before end of week. The equipment lease is current and will stay current." He paused. "I know what Darlene's been saying around town. I know what picture she's painting. I want you to have a different picture." Tom Birch was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The lease is fine, Gideon. It's always been fine." "Good. I will say," Tom chose his words with the care of a man who knew they'd be measured, Someone did come in last month and make an inquiry about what it would take to assume the note on the Mercer property. Not a purchase inquiry, just an inquiry. Gideon was still. An assumption inquiry. Yes. It would require your default first, which isn't going to happen. Which is what I told them, Tom said. But I thought you should know it had been asked. Gideon stood up and buttoned the middle button of his flannel out of habit. I appreciate that. She's been patient, Gideon. Tom said it quietly, the way someone says a thing that isn't exactly advice, but isn't exactly not advice either. 2 years, that's patient. Yes, Gideon said. It is. He drove home with the window down despite the cold, because the cold helped him think, and he needed to think clearly. Darlene hadn't just been talking around town. She'd been at the bank making contingency arrangements, which meant she had a timeline, and the timeline was tied to the harvest, which ended in a week and a half. Once the season closed, with no crew, with a damaged bunkhouse, with Gideon alone in the house again, that was when she'd move. That was when the offer would come, dressed in concern, carrying a casserole. He got home and found Elena in the back field, not in the kitchen, in the back field where the kitchen garden had been, the large plot Ruth had planted every year, which had gone to weeds and volunteer grass and gone feral since her death. Elena was there with a hoe Gideon didn't know they still had, working through the weed line along the east edge with the systematic efficiency she applied to everything. He stood at the fence and watched her for a moment. That's not your job. Neither was the back step, she said, not stopping. He climbed over the fence and stood in the overgrown garden. The soil where she'd cleared was dark and turned over, still good soil, the kind Ruth had spent 15 years improving with compost and care. He hadn't been in this garden since the summer before Ruth got sick, when he'd come to tell her supper was ready and found her on her knees in the dirt talking to the tomatoes in a completely serious tone of voice. I wasn't going to replant it, he said. Elena stopped hoeing. She looked at him. Are you going to now? He looked at the cleared section, dark against the gray-green overgrowth. It's September, he said. Too late for planting. Too late for summer crops, she agreed. Winter garlic goes in September. Kale will grow in frost. There's a dozen things you can put in the ground now for spring. She leaned on the hoe handle. Doesn't need to be what it was. Could be something different. He looked at the garden for a long moment. Ruth's garden, or what was left of it. The ghost of it, really. The shape, the good soil, the eastern sun exposure she'd chosen deliberately. The thing itself was gone. But the ground was still good. There's garlic at the feed store, he said. I'll pick some up this week. Elena nodded and went back to hoeing. He didn't leave. He found a second hoe leaning against the fence post. He really didn't know where that had come from. And he started working the west section, and they worked in opposite directions through the overgrowth without talking, and the afternoon went on, and the field came back by degrees. Caleb arrived on Saturday. Not when he was expected. He was supposed to come home the following Thursday, at the end of harvest, but he called Friday afternoon and said his grandmother's car needed service, and she was dropping him on her way to Billings, which was close enough to his grandmother's normal efficiency that Gideon didn't question it. He pulled up at 3 o'clock in his grandmother's white Jeep, and the grandmother, Helen, a solid 68-year-old woman who'd outlasted 2 husbands and was on a first-name basis with difficult opinions, came in for coffee and assessed Elena Ashcroft in the particular comprehensive way that older women assess new presences in the lives of their people. Elena gave her coffee and did not appear to notice the assessment, which Gideon suspected meant she noticed it very well. Caleb was taller than he'd been in July. He always seemed to grow in increments that Gideon only noticed in absence. 3 weeks away, and the boy came back changed in some small way. He had Ruth's eyes, gray-green and direct, and her quality of going still when he was thinking hard, which he was doing now, looking around the kitchen with those eyes taking in the herb box and the moved table and the lamp that had been put in a different corner. "Hey, Dad," Caleb said. "Hey." They shook hands, which was their way. Ruth had always laughed at that. You two shaking hands like businessmen, but it was what they did, had always done. and it meant something between them even if it looked formal to outsiders. Caleb looked at Elena. "You're Miss Ashcroft." "I am," she said. "Your dad mentioned you were coming. You want coffee, or are you too young for that?" "I'm 14, he said. "So probably too young, but I drink it anyway." Elena poured him a cup. Helen watched this and didn't say anything, which was its own kind of statement. Helen left at 4, which was sooner than her coffee visit usually lasted, and Gideon suspected she was giving them the house on purpose. He walked her to the Jeep, and she said, quietly enough that it was just the two of them. "She's good, Gideon." "She's the harvest cook," Gideon said. Helen looked at him the way women who had lived long enough looked at men who were still telling themselves the simplified version of things. "She's good," she said again, and got in the Jeep. Caleb found him in the equipment shed an hour later. This was also their way. Caleb didn't make big announcements about wanting to talk. He just appeared where Gideon was and started helping with whatever was happening, and the conversation came in the spaces between the work. Gideon was replacing the belt on the header. Again, different belt, same general problem. And Caleb handed him tools without being asked because he'd been in this shed often enough to know where things were. "Storm looked bad on the weather map," Caleb said. "It was a good one." Gideon torqued the belt tensioner. Fence came down, bunkhouse corner, couple pieces of equipment. "Tommy Caulfield's coming Thursday for the roof." "What about the equipment?" "Drying out. One tractor starter might be done. We'll see." Caleb handed him the wrench without being asked. "Is Darlene Pruitt actually trying to buy the ranch?" Gideon looked up. "Who told you that?" "Roy. Also, half the kids at school mentioned it this fall. Their parents talk." He put the wrench down and gave Caleb his full attention. The boy met it without flinching, which he'd always done. Looked you dead in the eye like he wanted to know the truth, even if it was hard. "She's made arrangements," Gideon said, "to be positioned to buy if I default, which I'm not going to do." "Is the ranch in trouble?" "No," Gideon said. Then, because this was what Elena had told him and he was trying to mean it, "There are things that need fixing. Bunkhouse, the fence, the garden. Normal ranch maintenance that got behind while things were difficult." He paused. "It's not in trouble. It's behind. That's different." Caleb absorbed that. He turned the extra wrench over in his hands. "Roy says Miss Ashcroft's been helping, not just the food. She has. He said she fixed the back step the first week." "She did." Caleb looked at the shed floor for a moment. Then, "Do you like her?" Gideon picked the belt tensioner back up. "She's good at her job." "Dad." "Caleb." "That's not what I asked." He stopped pretending to work on the header. He stood there in the shed with the afternoon light coming through the gaps in the boards, and he looked at his son, 14 years old, Ruth's eyes, who had spent the last 2 years at the edge of whatever room Gideon was in, making sure he was still there. "I don't know yet what I think about Elena Ashcroft," Gideon said. "I know that when she's here, the house feels different. I know she makes me think about things differently than I have been. Whether that's like or something else, I haven't worked out." He looked at Caleb directly. "Is that an honest enough answer?" Caleb looked back at him for a moment. Then he said, "Yeah, that's honest." They went back to the header belt. After a while, Caleb said, "She put stuff in Mom's window box." "I know. Different plants than Mom had." "I know." "That's okay," Caleb said, not like he was granting permission, like he was arriving at a conclusion he'd been working toward. "It's a different person. It'd be weird if they were the same plants." Gideon didn't answer. He tightened the belt and tested the tension and did not trust his voice for a moment. "Roy keeps texting you about the ranch," Gideon said finally. "Yeah." Caleb handed him the other wrench. "He said you'd be annoyed when you found out. Was he wrong?" A pause. "Little bit," it turned out. The last days of harvest were the hardest. Physically, but the most settled the ranch had felt in 2 years. Gideon could see it in the way the men moved. With the particular loose confidence of people who are near the end of something hard and know they're going to finish it. The wheat was coming in clean. The equipment, despite the storm, was holding. Roy ran the crew with the efficiency he always did at the end of a season, pushing for the finish line without cruelty. Caleb worked the last 4 days. Not light work, real work, up at 4 with the crew, in the field by first light. He was strong for his age and didn't complain, even when Manny ran him ragged on the West Field Wednesday afternoon. When he came in for supper that night, he could barely lift his fork for the first few minutes, but he ate 2 full plates and then went back for the leftover cornbread, and Elena put the plate closer to him without comment. Gideon watched his son eat and thought about continuity, about what it meant to be teaching this boy the ranch, not just the mechanics of it, the equipment in the fields and the seasonal rhythms, but the deeper thing, what you owed to land that you'd worked and what it owed you back, and how you stayed standing when the thing you'd built it for was gone. He hadn't done that right the last 2 years. He'd been so deep in the not staying standing part that the teaching had stopped. Caleb had been learning on his own, filling in the gaps with Roy's texts and his grandmother's blunt practicality and the instincts he'd inherited from a father who'd once known what he was building. It wasn't too late. That was what he kept coming back to. It wasn't too late. On Thursday morning, Darlene came. She didn't call ahead. She pulled up the drive at 9 in the morning when the crew was in the east field and Caleb was with them, and only Gideon and Elena were at the house. Gideon saw her car from the barn and met her in the yard. She was dressed more carefully than usual, which was a tell. She was carrying a folder. "Gideon," she said, "I wanted to talk to you before the season was over." "You could have called." This seemed like a conversation worth having in person. She held the folder slightly forward, not offering it yet. "I want you to know that whatever I've said around town, I wasn't trying to damage you. I was trying to be realistic." "Those things can coexist," he said. She opened the folder. "I have a purchase offer. Fair market, above, in fact. The kind of offer that lets you walk away with real money, pay off everything, and I'm not selling. Gideon, the bunkhouse roof is being repaired today." He looked at her steadily. "Tommy Caulfield is here right now. You probably passed his truck on the way in." She paused. She had. "The west fence is repaired," he said. "The lease is current. The harvest is 3 days from completion, ahead of last year's pace." He stood in the yard of his ranch with the morning sun hitting the fields behind him, and he said it all without heat, without performance, just a man stating the condition of what was his. "There's nothing to sell, Darlene." Her face did something complicated. Underneath the calculation, underneath the patience she'd been cultivating for 2 years, there was something that might have been genuine frustration, or even genuine feeling. He couldn't tell, and it didn't change anything. "You're not going to manage this alone," she said, quieter. "I know you think you can, but I'm not alone," Gideon said. She looked past him. Elena had come out the back door, not making a dramatic appearance, just come out with the dish towel on her shoulder the way she did in the afternoons, and was standing at the edge of the porch looking at the yard. Darlene looked at Elena, and then back at Gideon, and then at the folder in her hands. "This isn't a good plan," Darlene said, and for the first time in his memory, it sounded less like strategy and more like actual concern, the buried kind, the kind people have for people they've known 20 years, even when those feelings are wound up in everything else. "She's going to leave, Gideon. People like that—" "The offer's going back in your folder," Gideon said, gently, but without room to negotiate. "And it's going to stay there. I appreciate the concern. I mean that." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she closed the folder. "All right," she said. It came out small, which was something he hadn't expected from Darlene Pruitt. She got in her car. She drove down the lane and out to the county road. And that was that. Gideon stood in the yard for a moment. Then he turned around and walked to the porch where Elena was standing. "You heard," he said. "I came out to tell you Tommy's got a question about the roof beam." She looked at him. "But yes, I heard." He looked at her. "People like that," he said, repeating Darlene's phrase. Elena held his gaze. "I know what she meant." "Do you?" "She means people who move," Elena said. "People who don't stay." Something in her face was honest and difficult at the same time. "She's not wrong that I've been that person." "Have been," he said. Past tense. She looked at him for a long moment. The morning sun was on the porch and on the fields behind the house, and on the herb box in the kitchen window, visible through the glass. "Tommy's waiting," she said. "Elena." "Gideon." She met his eyes, and what was there was real and complicated and not ready to be named yet, but it was there. "Let's finish the harvest. Then we'll have the conversation." He held her gaze for one more second. Then he nodded and went to find Tommy Caulfield, and the morning went on. The east field came in on Saturday. Not the entire harvest, there were still 2 days of work in the north section, but the east field, which was the biggest and the most important, and the one that had been behind schedule until the crew found their rhythm, came in clean and on time on a cold, bright Saturday afternoon, and Roy called it at 4 o'clock, and the crew put the equipment to bed with the particular quiet satisfaction of people who have done a hard thing right. Gideon stood at the edge of the cleared field with his son beside him. The stubble was pale gold in the low afternoon light, stretching out to the tree line. He could smell the wheat dust still in the air, the dry, faintly sweet smell of it that meant a good harvest. Caleb said, "Is it enough? For the year?" "It's enough," Gideon said. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Dad, earlier this week, you said you were going to tell me things more honestly." He had said that. Not in those words exactly, but he'd meant to and hadn't quite gotten there. He'd been doing the thing he always did. Circling, coming close, finding reasons to wait. "I'm going to ask Elena to stay," he said. There it was. Out in the air, no taking it back. Not just through winter, longer than that. I don't know exactly what that looks like yet. I don't know what she'll say, but I'm going to ask her. Caleb stood there looking at the east field. Gideon didn't look at him. Gave him the space to have whatever reaction he was going to have without an audience. "Okay," Caleb said. Gideon looked at him. Just that, okay. Not enthusiastic, not resistant, just the plain-spoken acceptance of a boy who was, despite everything, his father's son. "That's all?" Gideon said. "I mean, the window box, Dad. She put things in it." Caleb glanced at him sideways with something that was almost Ruth's dry humor, just slightly less refined. "I'm not blind." Gideon looked back at the field. "She makes you talk," Caleb said more quietly. "You've talked more this week than you have in 2 years. I didn't know how much I missed that until it started again." He didn't say anything for a moment. The wind moved through the wheat stubble with a sound like paper. "Your mother used to say I processed things too slowly," Gideon said. "That by the time I'd worked out what I thought about something, the moment had usually moved on." Was she right? "Almost always," he said. Caleb put his hands in his jacket pockets. "Then don't process this one too slowly." They walked back to the house across the stubbled field, the light going orange low in the west, and the kitchen window was lit amber from inside where Elena was already starting supper, and the smoke was coming from the chimney because she'd figured out the backup igniter last week and had started using the furnace in the evenings, and the house looked, from the outside, like a house that had people in it who intended to stay. Gideon saw that. He let himself see it clearly, without the guilt, and without the fear, and without the argument he usually made against what he wanted, and he thought, this is what the ranch is supposed to look like. The harvest was almost done. The conversation was coming, and for the first time in 2 years, 3 months, and however many days he'd stopped counting, he was not dreading what came next. The north field came in on Monday. It came in the way the last section of a harvest always does. Not with ceremony, not with anything dramatic, just the machinery making its final passes in the low morning light, and then going quiet, and Roy walking the stubble line one last time the way he always did, the way his father had done on his family's ranch before him, checking what was left behind. Not much. Clean work. Gideon was at the equipment shed when Roy came back across the field, and Roy stopped in front of him and said, "That's it." And they shook hands the way they had every year for the last 12 years, including the 2 years when it had felt like going through motions. This year, it didn't feel like motions. "Good harvest," Roy said. "Good crew," Gideon said. Roy looked at him for a moment with the particular attention of a man who has watched his friend closely for 2 difficult years and is now trying to assess what he's seen. Whatever he found in Gideon's face seemed to satisfy him. He nodded once and went to tell the crew they were done. The celebration, such as it was, happened at the supper table. Elena had known the North Field was finishing today. You could tell by the sound of the equipment, by the particular quality of the late afternoon quiet when the machinery stopped. And she'd made a proper meal of it. Not a feast, because none of them were feast people, but a real meal. A roast she'd been working since morning, potatoes from the garden's surviving patch, cornbread that had gotten better over the course of 3 weeks as she learned the particular temperament of the cast iron skillet on that particular stove. The crew ate with the looseness of men who had finished something. Manny, who had not said more than 20 consecutive words to anyone all harvest, told a story about a harvest season in Colorado that involved a runaway baler and a very confused sheriff's deputy. And the table laughed, real laughter, not polite laughter. And even Gideon felt it pull at the corner of his mouth. Caleb was at the table. He'd stayed through the end of harvest instead of going back to his grandmother's, which had required a negotiation with the school that Gideon hadn't been involved in and suspected Helen had handled with her characteristic bluntness. He sat between Dell and Harlan and ate as much as Manny, and didn't seem to notice he was the youngest person at the table by 15 years. After supper, after the crew had drifted to the bunkhouse, which had its roof repaired now, Tommy Caulfield having done solid work in 2 days, after Caleb had gone to the front room with a book he'd been carrying around all week, Gideon came into the kitchen. Elena was at the sink. The kitchen was mostly clean, the lamp was on. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and then he said, "The harvest is done." She turned off the water. She turned around and dried her hands on the dish towel and looked at him. "Yes," she said. "You said we'd have the conversation when the harvest was done." "I did say that." He came fully into the kitchen and sat down at the table that was still 6 inches closer to the window than it had been when she arrived, and he'd stopped noticing that as a change and started noticing it as just where the table was. He put his hands flat on the wood. "I'm not good at this kind of thing," he said. "Saying what I mean directly. Ruth used to say I communicated the way a glacier moves. You could tell something was happening if you were paying close attention, but it took years to see the results." Elena sat down across from him. She set the dish towel aside. "I want you to stay," he said. "I asked you that before, and you gave me a waiting answer, and I understood why. But the harvest is done, and I'm asking again, and this time I want an actual answer." He held her gaze. "Not because I need a cook, not because the ranch needs managing, because I think you know what this place is supposed to be, and I think you give a damn about it. And I haven't had that since Ruth died, and I don't want to go back to not having it." Elena was quiet. "I'm not asking you to be Ruth," he said. "I'm not asking you to be anything except what you already are, which is someone who fixes back steps without being asked and puts things in empty window boxes because they need a chance." He stopped. "I'm also aware you've lost things that make what I'm asking complicated. I'm not asking you to forget Iris. I'm not asking you to be finished grieving her. I'm just—" "Gideon," she said. He stopped. She looked at him across the kitchen table with the lamp between them, the way it had been the night of the storm, and she said, "I know what you're asking." "And?" She was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough that his chest tightened. Then she said, "I've been in 7 states in 7 years. Every time I stayed somewhere long enough to know the names of things, I told myself it was temporary, and I moved on before it became anything else." She looked at the table. "That's not surviving. That's just running at a slow enough pace that it doesn't look like running." He waited. "I stopped in Dalton Creek because the truck needed a tire and the diner had a notice board," she said. "And I saw your card. And I called. And you sounded like someone who was also not moving but didn't know what else to do." She looked up at him. "I didn't expect to stay past harvest." "But," he said. "But the herb starts are doing well," she said. "And Caleb needed someone to drink coffee with at 4 a.m. this week. And I taught him how to check the oven temperature by hand, and—" She stopped. Something moved across her face. Iris would have liked this kitchen. She would have climbed on that counter and gotten into everything and made an absolute mess, and she'd have laughed the whole time. Her voice was steady when she said it. Not easy. It wasn't easy, you could hear that, but steady in the way that things are steady when they've been carried long enough that you've learned the weight of them. "I'm scared," she said. Plainly. No performance of strength around it. I've been scared of staying somewhere long enough for it to matter and then having it gone. That's what I've been managing. I know, he said. I've been managing the same thing from the other direction. She looked at him. I had it matter, he said, and it was gone anyway. And I spent 2 years deciding that was proof you shouldn't let things matter. He turned his hands over on the table. I don't think that's right anymore. I think the grief is the proof it mattered, not the reason to stop. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the north field was dark and finished, the wheat in, the season closed. Elena reached across the table and put her hand over his. Not a gesture of romance, not yet, maybe not for a long time yet, but the gesture of one person telling another, I hear you and I'm here and I'm not leaving tonight. All right, she said. All right, you'll stay? All right, I'll stay. She took her hand back. But I want proper standing. You said partner wage. I want that in writing. I'm not doing this as a favor or as a courtesy. If I'm staying as someone who has a real role here. That's what I want, he said. And I want to be able to do things my way in the kitchen and in the house without running it past you. The table stays where I put it. The table can stay where you put it. And Caleb gets to have his own opinion about this. I'm not asking him to accept anything. I'm asking him to tell me what he actually thinks, not what he thinks he's supposed to say. He'll tell you, Gideon said. He's honest to a fault, gets it from his mother. Elena nodded. She was quiet for a moment. Then, it's going to be complicated. There'll be days it's hard and we don't know what to do with each other. Probably most days, he said. I'm not easy to live with. Neither am I. I know, she said. I've been watching. He almost laughed. The almost was enough. He told Caleb the next morning. Not at the table and not with setup. They were in the barn doing the post-harvest equipment check when Gideon said, Elena's staying. She said yes. Caleb kept his hand on the tractor hitch he was inspecting. He was still for a moment, then, Good. That's all? What do you want me to say, Dad? He looked up. There was something in his face that was more complicated than the words suggested, something that was working its way through multiple feelings at once, the way 14-year-olds do when they're trying to handle things like adults and finding it costs more than they expected. I want you to not be the way you've been the last 2 years. I want the house to sound like a house again. It will, Gideon said. And I like her. He went back to the hitch. She told me yesterday that Iris used to try to count everything. Like everything. Fence posts, spoons, steps on a staircase. She'd count out loud. Elena said it drove her crazy and she'd give anything to hear it one more time. He was quiet for a moment. I think she tells the truth about things, even the things that are hard. She does, Gideon said. So that's good, Caleb said. That's what I've got. Gideon put his hand on his son's shoulder for a moment. Just a moment, because they were not demonstrative people, either of them. And then they went back to the equipment check. The crew left on Tuesday. They left the way harvest crews always leave, trucks loaded in the early morning, handshakes and back slaps in the yard. Roy last out the door because Roy was always last, double-checking that everything was as it should be before he'd consider his job done. Roy shook Gideon's hand in the yard and held it a beat longer than usual. Good season, Roy said. Good season, Gideon agreed. Roy looked at the house. Elena was on the porch, coffee in hand, watching the crew out. Caleb was beside her, taller in the morning light than he'd looked all week. Roy looked back at Gideon. You look different, Roy said. I feel different. Roy's mustache moved. Don't let it get away from you this time, whatever this is. I won't. I mean it, Gideon. You've been underwater for 2 years. It's enough. He said it the way a friend says a hard thing, without cruelty, but without softening it into uselessness either. Ruth would have told you the same thing by now. You know that. He did know that. He'd known it for a while, and it had taken him a long time to let it be true instead of a reproach. I know. Roy let go of his hand. He tipped his hat to Elena on the porch. She raised her coffee cup. Then Roy got in his truck and led the convoy down the lane and out to the county road and gone. The yard went quiet. Elena came down off the porch. She stood in the yard and looked around at the equipment shed, the barn, the repaired bunkhouse, the cleared garden on the south side, taking stock the way she did, not sentimentally, but practically, with the eye of someone deciding what came next. "What's the order?" she said. "Sorry?" "You do things in order," she said. "What's first?" He thought about it. "Winter garlic goes in the garden this week. I've got the starts from the feed store." "I know. I put them in the cold storage." After that, the south fence needs new posts on the gate section. That's been needed since spring. Then I want to get the tractor starter replaced before the first freeze. "Can Caleb stay through the week?" "He's supposed to be back in school Thursday." "Can he stay through Wednesday?" "Probably." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because he wants to help with the garlic, and I want to let him," she said simply. "It's better to plant things with someone than alone." That's not a life lesson, it's just true about garlic. He called Helen that afternoon and asked, and Helen said, in the voice of someone who had been expecting the call, "Of course he can stay. You need him there." Which told Gideon that Helen and Roy had been having their own communications about the Mercer Ranch, and he decided to let that go because the outcome had worked out. The three of them planted garlic on Wednesday morning. It was not an event. It was just work, kneeling in the turned soil Elena had cleared 3 weeks ago, pressing the cloves in at the right depth, covering them, moving down the row. Caleb counted the cloves out loud as he planted them, not to be funny, just because he was his mother's son, and some things came natural. At the 43rd clove, Elena looked at him and smiled. A real smile, not her polite one, the one that reached her eyes and changed her whole face. Caleb caught it and looked puzzled. "What?" "Nothing," she said. 43 is a good number." She went back to planting. Gideon saw it and understood it, and he let it be a private thing between her memory and this cold morning in the garden. November came in gray and cold, the way it always did. Gideon noticed for the first time that he didn't brace for it the way he had the last 2 Novembers. He noticed the cold and thought about the fence posts and the tractor starter and the garlic under the ground, and he thought about the woodpile and whether they had enough split for the first month, and all of that thinking was practical rather than defeated. It was the thinking of a man who intended to be here in December. Elena had rearranged the front room somewhere in October. He'd come home from a fence repair to find the furniture shifted, nothing drastic, just moved so the room oriented toward the wood stove instead of the window, which made more sense for winter. Ruth's needlework was still beside the kitchen window, where he'd always left it. Elena had not moved that, and she never would, and he knew that without having to say it. Some things you left where they were, not because you were stuck, but because where they were was right. He found himself thinking about Ruth differently than he had in 2 years. Not less, not gone, not replaced, but differently. Less like an open wound and more like a scar, which still marked you and still told a story and was part of what you were, but didn't bleed anymore when the weather changed. He didn't know exactly when that shift had happened, somewhere in September. Somewhere between the window box and the storm and the kitchen table those 2 in the morning, 2 people sitting with the specific kind of loss that doesn't leave but learns to share space. He thought about what Roy had said. Ruth would have told you the same thing by now. She would have. That was true. Ruth had never been patient with self-destruction dressed up as loyalty. She'd have given him a year, maybe, and then she'd have started leaving subtle and unsubtle hints, and by the 2nd year she'd have said it plainly. "Gideon, I'm gone and you're still here, and those are 2 different conditions that require 2 different responses." He could hear it in her voice. That was not a painful thing. It was something adjacent to comfort, and he let it be that. Tom Birch called in early November. Not about the loan, about something else. He called, which was unusual, and said, "I wanted to let you know, Darlene Pruitt has put her own property on the market. The south acreage, the 2 sections below the ridge. I thought you should hear it from me." Gideon was at the kitchen table. Elena was nearby, giving no indication she was listening, which meant she was listening. "Why is she selling?" "She's moving to Arizona," Tom said. "She has family there. He paused. "I think the plan didn't work out the way she expected, and she's adjusting." "Who's buying?" "That's the other thing I wanted to mention. Those 2 sections border your west pasture." Gideon was quiet for a moment. He looked at Elena. She had set down what she was doing. "What's the asking price?" he said. Tom told him. It was fair. It was probably fair on purpose. Darlene, for all her calculation, had apparently decided that if she was going, she'd rather sell to someone who'd work the land than let it sit. "I'll come in this week," Gideon said. He put the phone down. Elena was looking at him from across the kitchen. "She's leaving," he said. "I heard." Elena sat down. "The south sections? That's the land below the West Ridge?" "Good grazing land. Her family had cattle on it 20 years ago, and she never did anything with it after they sold off the herd. It's been fallow." He rubbed the back of his neck. "It's also the section she was going to use as leverage. If I ever did default, she'd have had access to the water easement on the south boundary." "And if you own it?" "That easement's mine," he said, "and the grazing land doubles what I can run in spring." Elena looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked up. "Can you do it? Financially?" "It'd be tight. We'd have to run lean through spring." "Define lean." "No new equipment. Minor repairs only. Crew budget cut for the first season." He looked at her. "You'd be taking less than we agreed. For a year." "How much less?" He told her. She didn't flinch. She did the math in her head. He could tell by her expression that brief interior calculation she did before she said anything about money. "That's workable," she said. "If we put in a proper kitchen garden in spring, I can cut the supply cost by a third. Maybe more." She looked at him. "Do it." "You're sure?" "It's the right land at the right time," she said. "You don't say no to that because the timing's inconvenient." He went to the bank Thursday morning. He signed papers Friday. The land transferred in December, after the freeze had locked the ground and the south section stood quiet under the first thin snow of winter, waiting for spring the way land does, without impatience, without doubt, just ready. The first real snowfall came the second week of December. Not a storm, nothing like September. A proper snowfall, the kind that came in overnight and left everything covered and new-looking in the morning, and Caleb was home for winter break and came into the kitchen at 6 in the morning and said, "It snowed," with the tone of someone who knew this perfectly well but felt it warranted mentioning. "Noticed," Elena said. She handed him coffee. Gideon came in from the morning check. The animals settled, the barn doors holding, nothing to worry about, and hung his coat in the mudroom and stood at the kitchen doorway looking at the two of them at the table. Elena with her tea and Caleb with his borrowed coffee and the window above the sink showing a white yard and a white field, and the herb starts doing whatever herb starts do under December snow. He stood there a moment longer than he needed to. "You going to come in?" Caleb said. He came in. He poured his coffee and sat at the table that was still where Elena had moved it, where the morning light hit it right, and the three of them sat together in the early winter kitchen, and nobody said anything particularly important for a while. That was its own kind of thing, the ordinary kind. The kind people mistake for nothing because it happens quietly, without announcement, on an unremarkable Tuesday morning in December. But it was not nothing. It was the accumulated result of everything that had happened since September. The harvest, and the storm, and the conversations in the lamplight, and the garlic in the ground, and the paperwork at the bank. All of it arrived at this table, this ordinary morning, coffee, cooling in cups. "I want to paint the bunkhouse in spring," Elena said. "The exterior. It's been gray too long." "What color?" Caleb said. "Not white. Something that looks like it belongs here." She thought about it. "Red. Barn red. With white trim." Caleb considered this with the seriousness he applied to most things. "That's a lot of painting." "Yes, it is," Elena said. "Good thing there will be 3 of us." Gideon looked at his coffee. "I didn't agree to paint the bunkhouse." "You didn't say no either," Elena said. "I'm saying no." "You're thinking about it," she said. He was thinking about it. The bunkhouse had been gray since he could remember, and barn red was not a bad idea, and he was almost certainly going to agree to it before spring. They both knew that, but they'd learned in 3 months of living in the same house the rhythm of how they moved toward decisions together. Him pushing back first, her holding the position, and somewhere in the middle they usually found what was right. It was not smooth, it was not simple. There had been a week in October where they hadn't spoken properly for 3 days over a disagreement about the equipment storage schedule that was on the surface about equipment and was underneath about control and the particular difficulty of two independent people learning to share a space without one of them disappearing into it. Elena had eventually said, plainly, "I need you to tell me when something's wrong instead of going quiet. I can't read silence the way some people can." And he'd said, "Honestly, I've been going quiet for 2 years and it became a habit." And she'd said, "I know, break it." He was working on breaking it, some days better than others. The day she moved her things from the single bed in the narrow spare room to the room across the hall, the room with the better light, the room that had been a guest room before it became a storage room before it became unused, she did it without ceremony, in an afternoon while Gideon was at the south fence, and when he came in and saw the spare room empty, he stood in the doorway of it for a moment. Not with grief, with something more like readiness. The room was empty and the house was full, and those two things were both true and neither canceled the other. He went and found her in the kitchen. "New room, working out?" he said. "The window's better," she said. "I can see the garden." "Good," he said, and that was that. By February, the valley had started to talk. Ranches talk to each other the way small communities always do. Not through formal channels, but through the accumulation of small observations. Roy mentioning to a neighbor's foreman that the Mercer harvest had come in ahead of schedule. Tommy Caulfield telling someone at the hardware store about the bunkhouse roof job and how the place was being kept up. Mrs. Caulfield sending a note to 3 friends about the herb garden she'd seen started in the fall. The south sections transferring to the Mercer deed got noted at the county office, and that information made its way around the way information does. By February, people had started calling. Not about anything dramatic. About work, mostly. Whether Gideon was hiring spring help, whether the Mercer Ranch might have work for a capable man looking for steady placement. One call from a woman named June Fairley, who had been running her late husband's sheep operation alone for a year, and wanted to know about the south grazing sections, whether any of it might be available for seasonal lease. Gideon said yes to June Fairley, because the south sections in spring could carry her sheep without conflicting with his cattle rotation, and the lease income helped with the land payment, and because Elena said she'd met June at the feed store, and she was a serious woman who knew her animals. Elena's judgment on people had turned out to be reliable, not infallible. She'd trusted a supply company that had let them down twice by March, and she'd been irritated with herself about it in the blunt way she was irritated with herself about anything, which was briefly and then over. But she read people well, and she was honest about what she saw, and Gideon had learned to factor her read in when he was making decisions about who to work with. That was not a small thing. He hadn't taken anyone's judgment into account in 2 years, because there hadn't been anyone whose judgment he trusted in his house. He'd made every decision alone, which is how people end up making bad ones for too long. Not because they're foolish, but because a single perspective has edges that another person would see. Roy came by in March to discuss the spring crew, and he sat at the kitchen table and drank Elena's coffee and talked logistics for an hour. And when he was leaving, he said to Gideon quietly at the door, "Last year you'd have been doing this in the equipment shed at midnight because you couldn't sit at that table." Gideon looked at the table. "I know." "I'm not making a point," Roy said. "I'm just glad to see it." "Roy?" I know. He put his hat on. "See you in May." The spring came the way springs always come in Montana, badly and then suddenly and then completely, like someone changed their mind fast. By April, the south sections were greening up, and June Fairley's sheep were on the lower pasture, and the kitchen garden was full of things Elena had started in the house since February under the south window because she was, as Caleb had observed, aggressively optimistic about seeds. The garlic came up in May. It came up in the rows they'd planted in October, Caleb counting out loud to 43 cloves and then losing count and starting over. And when the first shoots broke the surface, Elena saw them from the kitchen window and came outside and stood over them for a moment. Gideon came up beside her. She didn't say anything. He didn't say anything. The garlic shoots were pale green and fragile-looking and entirely correct. After a while, she said, 43 plants. "Counting?" he said, trying to remember which clove was which. She looked at the row. Iris would have counted them every morning. She'd have gotten mad when the number didn't change. He stood beside her in the garden. What would you have told her? I'd have told her they were all 43, just underground doing their work. Elena looked at the shoots. She'd have said that was a bad answer. Was she right? Almost always, Elena said. And there it was. The same thing he'd said about Ruth 5 months ago, to the same question. She heard the echo of it. He saw her hear it. Neither of them made anything of it. They just stood in the garden in the spring morning beside 43 garlic plants that had come up exactly as they were supposed to. That was what the last year had looked like, if you stood back from it. Not a story of dramatic rescue or love that solved everything. Not a story where grief was defeated or loss was undone. Two people who had each been carrying something that didn't get lighter. It just became possible to carry differently, which is the closest most people ever get to better. The ranch that had been falling into silence was full of sound again. Not the same sound, that it never would be the same, and he'd made his peace with that. The impermanence of every particular arrangement. The way everything good is temporary, which is also what makes it matter. Different sound. Elena's voice in the kitchen at 4 in the morning, Caleb's boots on the repaired back step, the sheep on the south pasture and the garlic in the ground, and Roy's truck on the lane in May. And somewhere in the mix, quieter than the rest, the particular sound of a man who had decided that surviving was not enough, that restarting was not the same as starting over, that the ground was still good even after the hardest winter. Gideon Mercer, standing in his garden in May, was not a man who had arrived anywhere. He was a man who was moving again, which was all he'd ever asked of himself, even when he'd forgotten to ask. He had the south sections. He had the garlic coming up. He had a son who shook his hand in the barn and was growing taller every time he looked away, and a woman across the kitchen table who told him the truth even when it took something from her to do it, and a window box that was full of things that were doing exactly what she said they would. They need a chance. Yes, that was it. That was the whole of it, as plainly as it could be said. Everything needed a chance. The seeds, and the ranch, and the man inside the ranch, and the grief inside the man. All of it, just a chance. You gave it the conditions it needed, you did the work in order, and then you let it do what it was going to do. The garlic was going to be ready in July. He was already thinking about what to plant in August.